He's remembered for the floating of the dollar, the wages accord, and of course...
I tell you what, any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up today is a bum.
Welcome to ABC News and our continuing coverage of the death of Bob Hawke at the age of 89. He was considered one of the nation's most charismatic and popular prime ministers. Mr Hawke led the country from 1983 to 1991. As well as substantial economic and industrial relations reform, the Hawke era was also marked by environmental activism.
In the spring of 1983, the nation and its new Prime Minister were high on America's Cup fever.
I tell you what, any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up today is a bum.
Robert James Lee Hawke had swept to power just 6 months earlier. His victory over Malcolm Fraser was decisive, his rise to the Labor leadership even more swift and brutal.
I believe that a drover's dog could lead the Labor Party to victory.
Mr Hawke, could I ask you whether you feel a little embarrassed tonight at the blood that's on your hands?
You're not improving, are you? I thought you'd make a better start to the year than that. It's a ridiculous question, you know it's ridiculous. I have no blood on my hands.
Born in border town South Australia and educated in Perth, the gregarious Rhodes Scholar always had the Prime Ministership in his sights. He began a successful reign as ACTU President in 1970. But it wasn't for another decade, with the resolve to swear off alcohol, he finally entered federal parliament. Bob Hawke's first term in office was marked by significant and symbolic change. He stopped the damming of the Franklin River in Tasmania.
You do not move immediately, you will be arrested.
Produced a landmark wages accord with the unions and proclaimed Advance Australia Fair the national anthem.
At previous Olympics, for instance, that you have the Brits getting up, they win a medal, and you know they do win one occasionally, and up this goes the God Save the Queen. Then Australians get up and it's the same anthem. Now, that's crazy.
During the 1980s, Bob Hawke walked all over a divided coalition. He defeated Andrew Peacock, John Howard and even the Joe for Canberra campaign. All in all, there would be 4 election victories over nearly 9 years in office, making him Labor's longest-serving Prime Minister.
Friends, this is a moment of pride and of gratitude.
Bob Hawke's political success and consensus style largely kept his ambitious treasurer Paul Keating in check. The pair combined in their pursuit of economic reform, floating the Australian dollar, dismantling tariffs and deregulating the banking system. But leadership tension inevitably unravelled their partnership, and in 1991, on his second attempt, the young challenger brought an end to the Hawke reign.
Paul Keating polled 5 votes ahead of Bob Hawke, 56 to 51. Thank you very much.
If this was 11 years ago, I'd be getting pretty thoroughly drunk. But fortunately, fortunately for me, and even more fortunately for others, that is 11 years ago, and the only beer that will be passing my lips will be the totally non-alcoholic variety.
While he projected a knockabout character, not before or since has Australia watched a Prime Minister display such raw emotion. There was his televised confession of infidelity.
They mean that I wasn't faithful to my wife.
Was that true?
Yes.
And a breakdown over his daughter's battle with heroin.
You don't cease to be a husband. You don't cease to be a father. And my children and my wife have a right to be protected in this matter.
Bob Hawke was married to Hazel for nearly 40 years before they divorced in the mid-1990s, and he married his biographer Blanche Dalpuget. He was a Labor warrior until the end, campaigning for Kevin Rudd in 2007, then Julia Gillard in 2010.
Favourite son of the party, campaigning legend, ladies and gentlemen, Bob Hawke.
But it wasn't just the prospect of victory drawing the former PM back to the stage.
I've been everywhere.
Bob Hawke made himself available to candidates across the country, even when their prospects were grim.
The polls don't look good, we know that.
In his last press conference as Prime Minister, Bob Hawke was asked how he'd like to be remembered.
I guess as a bloke who loved his country, still does, and loves Australians, and who was not essentially changed by high office.
Well, for his insights, we're joined from Melbourne by ABC's Insiders host Barry Cassidy. Barry, you worked for Bob Hawke in his media office from 1986 to 1991. Your personal reflections tonight, given this must be a difficult situation for you?
Yeah, well, I think he deserves to be remembered as certainly the Labor Party's greatest leader. He won 4 elections. No other Labor leader did that. And he was a great reformer, together with Paul Keating. He did open up the Australian economy to the world, including floating the dollar. The very first thing he did as Prime Minister was to get together the economic summit. That brought together the unions and the employers, and everybody sat around, and out of that emerged the Prices and Incomes Accord, and that had a profound influence on the Australian economy for years to come.
It was all about consensus, wasn't it, Barry?
Well, he said that. His slogan in 1983 when he first came to office was bringing Australia together. Now, as he saw it, there had been a fairly disruptive period before that under Malcolm Fraser, but his view was that Australia needed to be brought together, and to do that, you needed consensus. You needed somebody who could talk to both the unions and the employers, and he could do that. He had a lot of friends among the employers, some of the biggest employers in Australia, and he really made that work for him.
How would you describe his leadership style, and what was it like to work with him?
Well, he was a consensus leader, and he liked to talk his way through issues. A lot of people thought he was kind of an abrasive character because he didn't suffer fools. He didn't particularly like the media, and so occasionally he was pretty scratchy in some of those situations. But he wasn't like that at all when he was trying to negotiate his way through a difficult problem. He would sit down, he was a very good listener, and he would spend ages just listening, which again would surprise a lot of people. And then at the end of an hour or so, he might make some sort of a judgment on what he had just heard. And he was easy to work with. He was very patient with some people who were learning on the job, including myself. He was a delight to work with.
Yeah, he was described as a larrikin. He liked to drink, but of course, famously, he gave that up.
Look, he wouldn't have succeeded as Prime Minister if he hadn't done that. I think that's a reasonable assessment to make. He had a problem. He had a serious problem with drinking. But he exercised that. That was enormous discipline to give it up after those years, and to give it up for the entire time that he was Prime Minister. The drinking was kind of... it wasn't just that he held the world record, for speed drinking at Oxford University. It was more than that. He was a constant drinker, and it was having an impact on his family and on his professional life. But, he knuckled down and gave it away, and it just worked for him.
What was it about him that attracted you to want to work with him?
Well, because I was from Melbourne, and I had maybe a stronger sense of the guy than some of the people by the time I'd got to the Canberra Press Gallery. And I just had a feeling he was going to be somebody really special. And because I sensed very early on that ability he had to communicate with people, and that people felt comfortable with him. He had ideas. He would go into elections, full of ideas. And so I thought at the time that if I was ever going to get an experience from, politics from the inside, it's probably only Bob Hawke that I could do it with, certainly of the field that was available at the time. And I never regretted it. It was just a wonderful learning experience.
Barry, earlier you told us about what impressed you most about Bob Hawke. Can you tell us again?
He abhorred racism and bigotry, and whenever he experienced it, he called it out. You didn't have to go to Bob Hawke and say, look, this has just happened. what should we do? He would hear it and he would respond, he would react instantly. And he had a history of that. You know, as I explained before, he had a history in his fight against apartheid. And he played a major role in terms of turning over apartheid in South Africa. But before that, he led the protests against the Springboks when they came to Australia, when he was ACTU leader. When there was talk of a discriminatory immigration policy, he was right onto it. He didn't care whether that was that might be popular with the public or not. He went to town on it straight away, went into the Parliament with a resolution and ended up embarrassing the opposition at the time. So, look, he was just so instinctive on that issue, absolutely instinctive, and that's probably the most profound impact I think that he had on me in the whole time that I was with him.
Barry Cassidy, good to talk to you again tonight.
Thank you.
And joining us now is Peter Harcher, political editor at the Sydney Morning Herald. And Peter, let's just start with the front page of the Herald. And we get a shot up of that. We can see that, well, I don't know whether we have it, but it is, of course, there we go. Bob Hawke, a great character, a great communicator.
Yes, and no matter how many times you play that clip of him after the America's Cup saying any employer who sacks a bloke for taking a day off is a bum, I get a laugh out of it every time. That was a line that was not tested by any focus group. That was a bloke saying what was on his mind, and it was one of the reasons that he was able to carry the public with him, even as he did, as that headline said there, the fearless reformer, even as he led a reforming government. Look, any political leader can take office and say, look, this is the status quo, I'll just coast along, I'll issue a few press releases, do a few performances, do a couple of twiddles and I'll get re-elected, don't take any risks. Hawke did the opposite. Hawke took on the biggest challenges facing the country, took on an enormous task of economic rejuvenation. People talk about the floating of the dollar, which really was just a minor administrative detail in a much bigger picture. But its power is it's a metaphor, and it's a metaphor for what the Hawke, Keating, Susan Ryan governments did, which was to make the economy flexible, take a rigid economy and make it flexible. And that's the central reason that we've had nearly 28 years of unbroken economic growth, a record for any country, any developed country in the world. It's the flexibility which has meant Australia's economy has been able to adjust seamlessly to all the major shocks thrown at it. The question now is, we are at a juncture where we see that model after 28 years needing new work. We see productivity in trouble, we see wages growth in trouble, we see new effort and new ideas need to be brought to fix this problem. Now, you've seen the current Labor leader, Bill Shorten, trying to model himself on Bob Hawke, and, good for him. But the problems are different. It'll require a lot more energy, and whoever's in office after Saturday, if they're seriously going to try and act as they say they want to, which is in Bob Hawke's mould and Bob Hawke's legacy, then they need to bring energy and courage, the same sort of courage, to the task of reform for the next 28 years.
Peter Harcher, do you think we'll see another leader like Bob Hawke in Australia, or do you think modern politics, someone like Bob Hawke, wouldn't be the same?
Well, Bob Hawke was a bit of a messiah figure in Australian politics. He took the office as already an enormous Australian folk hero because he'd been such a problem solver in his role as the head of the union movement at the ACTU. And he was seen as a messiah. Since then, Australia's tried a couple of other messiah-type leaders. One was Kevin Rudd and the other was Malcolm Turnbull. They were both greeted as messiahs with astronomical approval ratings. The political system, and in particular their own political parties, didn't suit them. It didn't suit the messianic style of leader anymore because they were happy to take their opinion poll ratings, but then they were equally happy to trash and destroy those leaders through the political self-indulgence of the factions, the movements and the individual ambitions of the politicians in their own parties. So to answer your question, Karina, a couple of politicians have tried to come in as messianic leaders. Their parties have shredded them and have not created any opportunity for a messianic leader any longer.
Peter Harcher from the Sydney Morning Herald, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure, Andrew.
Well, let's now cross to Canberra and our political editor, Andrew Probyn, who is at Parliament House. Andrew, good evening to you. This comes, of course, on the eve of the election. How does this affect the election?
Well, the losing a Labor legend of the stature of Bob Hawke is going to certainly change the tenor of the last day. He was a transformative figure, as we've heard, a character in politics larger than life, a real larrikin, but someone who brought amazing intellect to to reform, economic reform, environmental reform and social reform. And the winner of the May 18 poll, as Peter Hartcher has been alluding to, is going to need some of that magic to get Australia's economy going. As though some of the pressures on the economy are very different to what they were then. We're in a low inflation environment, not a high inflation environment. But I speak to you from the Parliament House. Bob Hawke was the first Prime Minister to be Prime Minister in this new building, opened in 1989. And there's a lot of places around this building where you have cause for reflecting on Bob Hawke. In the press gallery, there's a hilarious picture of him opening Radio Alley, and he's duelling with Andrew Peacock in the most hilarious of manners. And we also have another picture in the press gallery. I'd like to show it actually to you because I've just asked someone to take it off the wall. Now, I happen to be the captain of the parliamentary press gallery team, and we got a very famous picture of Bob Hawke framed, and we actually asked him to sign it a couple of years ago. And I'm going to show it to you here because it tells you a lot about the man, as love of life. There's quite a wire there. Now, you see, it's that famous picture of him getting belted in the face during a game. It was bowled by Gary O'Neill, who was then a Herald reporter. It was the day before, believe it or not, the day before the 1984 election started. Now, Gary O'Neill felt terrible about this. He just felled the Prime Minister, who was on 28 runs. And I was reliably told that he might have been out earlier in the day, but he turned to the umpire and said, "I don't think that was out, was it?" So he kept batting and then got belted in the face by Gary O'Neill. Shards of glass ended up being in his eye.
There was serious concern about his eyesight.
There was serious.
We did play some of that vision earlier, so I wonder if we can dig it up again.
Yes, we could dig it up, but so. There was a young reporter who took a shard of glass from his eye. He was whisked off to Canberra Hospital, but he was back about an hour later, lounging in his budgie smugglers on a banana chair. Now, the next day, the election started, and Bob Hawke decided that he would ask a one-eyed Bob Hawke, I might add at this stage, that it was first day of the election campaign. He asked Gary O'Neill to be somewhat of a victim. They strung a line between two ships in Jervis Bay, and Bob Hawke said that Gary O'Neill should be the one who was strung up between those two ships and sent in a flying way. So, look, there's great memories in this building for Bob Hawke, not just in the seriousness of political reporting, but also in political life. And here we see the moment when he was felled by Gary O'Neill, who obviously monstrously concerning for everyone involved. I think that was at Reed Oval, where we've had several major games over the years.
Yeah, and of course that was the era when there were no helmets. But I reckon that even if there were helmets, that Bob Hawke probably would have said no need for that.
No, and he insisted on batting long and hard almost at every game, whether he was out or not.
So, Andrew, there have, of course, been responses and reactions from our two leaders in the midst of the election campaign.
That's right. We've had Bill Shorten spoke first, and a very emotional Bill Shorten spoke alongside Craig Emerson, who worked with Bob Hawke for many years. He talked of the legacy, the fact that he had transformed the economy, effectively the lives of modern Australia through many of his reforms. We also heard from Scott Morrison, who paid tribute.
I would like to thank Craig Emerson and Blanche de Pilget for asking me to say a few words on behalf of the Labor Party and the Labor movement. Tonight, the nation and Labor are in mourning. We have lost a favourite son. Bob Hawke loved Australia, and Australia loved Bob Hawke. But his legacy will endure forever. Bob Hawke changed Australia for the better. He brought people together. He brought Australia together. He modernised our economy. He transformed our society. He protected our environment. I last had the privilege of seeing Bob last week on his back veranda, sitting out there with his beloved Blanche, supported by Craig. He had his son, the sun on his face, had a crossword in front of him, a cup of tea. He didn't speak about himself to me. He did as he always does. Asked about the ALP and the election. We all loved Bob Hawke. We'll miss him a great deal. May he rest in peace. The condolences of my party and my movement to the great Bob Hawke.
Tonight, Australians have all learned the news of the passing of one of Australia's great Prime Ministers, and certainly Labor's greatest Prime Minister, in my view. The 23rd Prime Minister of Australia, Robert James Lee Hawke. His achievements will be spoken of in the days ahead, but the thing Australians will remember most about him was the bloke. He made Australia stronger through his contribution to public life. He had a great intellect, he had enormous passion, and he had courage. And that was able to sustain him in being the longest-serving Labor Prime Minister of all time. But it was his ability to connect with everyday Australians, with a word, with that larrikin wit, with that connection and an understanding of everyday Australian life, that we will most remember Bob Hawke. I want to extend to Bob's wife Blanche, on behalf of Jenny and I, our deep personal sympathies, and to all of Bob's family, and also to acknowledge the late Hazel Hawke as well. Bob lived a full life. He lived a rich life, and in his life he blessed many others. And for that, I think, as Australians, we can give him great thanks. One thing I remember amongst many, it was Bob Hawke who changed our national anthem to say, "Australians all, let us rejoice." And tonight, while I'm sure I extend to the Labor movement and to Bill Shorten and his party my deep sympathies on behalf of our political movement, I think we can all say, as Australians all, that we rejoice in the life of Bob Hawke. We thank him for his service to our nation, and we pray now that he rest in peace. Thank you, Bob.
Well, there we have it. Scott Morrison there talking after the passing of Bob Hawke. We've also heard or seen statements in the past few hours from former Labor and Liberal Prime Ministers. We've Kevin Rudd has sent a message in recent minutes saying that Bob Hawke is a giant of Australian politics. He and Paul Keating internationalised the Australian economy. He established APEC and radically deepened Australia's engagement with Asia. He established Medicare. Together with Therese and the entire nation, I mourn his passing. Julie Gillard put out a longer statement, but I'll read a shorter version because it's the personal element that she tweeted. Bob Hawke was the greatest peacetime leader Australia has ever had. As a teenager, Bob inspired me. As a PM, he guided me. I will miss him. I will wish so very much that Bob had been able to see one more election day. Now, that is a theme that was taken up by Paul Keating, who was also referring to what we're all going to experience in a day and a half's time, the May 18 election. Paul Keating, who shares much of the Hawke legacy, refers to the fact that Bob, of course, was hoping for a Labor victory this weekend, and his friends too were hoping that he would see this. So emotion all around on what is a very significant day. And the passing of a very significant figure in modern Australia.
Andrew, thanks very much.
Well, let's bring in our panel. Joining us here in the studio in Sydney is Susan Ryan, the former Aged Care Discrimination Commissioner and the First Minister assisting the Prime Minister for the status of women in Bob Hawke's government in 1983. And Wendy McCarthy, a close personal friend of Hazel Hawke and the first department chair of the ABC in 1983, a role she was appointed to by Bob Hawke. Wendy McCarthy, good to have you here as well. We'll get your thoughts first on the passing of Bob Hawke.
It just feels an era that was so profoundly important to the Australia we live in today. And I think at a personal level, Bob Hawke gave me probably the greatest career opportunity of my life by appointing me to the ABC. And I didn't know him at the time. I didn't get to know him until some years later. But I knew Hazel and she and I were good friends, but Bob recreated social, political, artistic, broadcasting infrastructure in Australia. He understood that we don't live by money alone. He had ideas, vision, belief, and at other times, so I had a long relationship when I finally met him about 1985, 86, I think, 85. I had a long relationship through Hazel with him, and I really respected and admired the capacity he had to look at women's lives in a very particularly generous and thoughtful way. And people would say to me, Della, he's a womaniser. And I'd say, he's a woman enabler. He actually gave us opportunities that we could never have dreamt of.
Well, I'm going to talk about that a little more now with Susan Ryan. Susan, you were brought in to Bob Hawke's cabinet as the only woman.
Correct.
He obviously gave you that opportunity. Your thoughts tonight on his passing?
Well, I feel personally a deep sense of loss. I mean, I knew Bob was fading and I should have expected it, but I didn't. When I heard the news earlier this evening, I felt quite devastated. And I did think of how much Australia's lost. And I felt personally I had the opportunity as the first woman in the Labor cabinet to do things that, as a young feminist, I would never thought would happen. And we got the sex discrimination legislation through. These days people take it for granted. Then it was like World War III. Other programs I pursued for women were very unpopular. Shock jocks hated them. Right-wing organisations hated them. Bob never flinched.
No, never.
When the whole thing was going berserk and they're saying, oh, what's Ryan doing now? Surely she doesn't have to do it this year. Can't we wait till next year? I'd say, Bob, this is, this is our commitment. This is what we said we do. He said, we'll do it. And it was very important that he supported it, because I was a cabinet minister, but I wasn't the Prime Minister. If he hadn't supported it, it wouldn't have happened. And I know now, younger women take a lot of things for granted, but really if I hadn't had the total unflinching support of Bob for this quite unpopular but crucial legislation to say it is now against the law to discriminate against women in employment, housing, health, whatever, it wouldn't have happened. And people think these things might have just happened anyway. I'm telling you, they would not have without Bob's support.
And there was pushback from within your own party.
Oh, for sure, for sure. It wasn't a natural position for Labor in those days. And even the Cabinet, I mean, they were basically good blokes and stuff, but they didn't see a priority. Oh, my God, we're deregulating the economy, you know, we're taking off tariffs, we're doing all these things. We can't be distracted by all this storm about legislation to protect women.
And is that the kind of terminology that was used at the time?
No, they didn't say girl stuff. No, they just saw it as
our joke.
You know, a nice idea, Ryan, but can't we leave it till later? Or they would say things like, my wife doesn't think all this stuff matters. I said, well, I don't know. Have you asked her? But Bob never did that. Bob said it's a Labor commitment. And, of course, in all his years as leader of the ACTU, he supported equal pay. He was the national leader who supported equal pay. He understood the industrial situation. He understood the poverty and despair that women were forced into when they couldn't earn a living. So he was right there. And when Bob supported a position, in the end, Cabinet supported it.
When do we talk about gender equality today? Still a long road to travel, of course, but do you feel as though he helped set things in motion back in the early 80s?
Absolutely. I mean, Whitlam did the first big visionary crash through, and sometimes it was hard to see what was going to come after. But then Bob took it up, and Bob had a completely different way. There was a coherent roadmap and plan, it seemed. And in the case of the ABC, there'd been a major inquiry, the Dix inquiry, and the ABC was a commission in those days, and they recommended it become a corporation. And most people in the ABC didn't realise that meant that the ABC could borrow and invest. But Ken Meyer and I knew that, which is why we were sitting in this building. So Bob looked at things strategically and structurally, and if he trusted you, you just got on with it. And then some years later, I was trying to raise money for the Royal Hospital for Women, and he'd just come out of Parliament, and I asked him if he would help, and he said, I won't go to any meetings, but I'll open every door. And in a way, that was a metaphor for Bob. I could ring him and say, could you get me into Westpac, or could you get me this here? And it's exactly as Susan said, if he believed that this was the proper thing to do, he would support you all the way. And, I mean, what an extraordinary thing for a government to do that.
Wendy McCarthy, stay with us. Susan Ryan, please stay with us. Let's cross now to our reporter Lily Mayers, who's outside the Hawke family home in Sydney. She joins us now. Lily, what have we heard from the family tonight?
Karina, a statement has been released from Bob Hawke's wife, Blanche Dalprige, this evening. It said that the former Prime Minister died peacefully here at his Northbridge home in Sydney's north. The 89-year-old is survived by his wife Blanche, as well as their 3 children and his stepchildren. The statement said there will be a private funeral held for the family. That will then be followed by a public memorial in Sydney in the coming weeks. The statement then listed some of Bob Hawke's proudest achievements. They, of course, included establishing Medicare, increasing the proportion of children in Australia finishing high school, positioning Australia into the Asia century, having a role in ending apartheid in South Africa and protecting Antarctica from mining. The statement also pointed out the importance of the partnership between Bob Hawke and Paul Keating and how they both modernised Australia's economy, leading to an unprecedented period of recession-free growth in the country. The statement made a special mention to Bob Hawke's father, who was a reverend. The statement said Bob abhorred racism and bigotry, and that his father, the Reverend Clem Hawke, told him that if you believed in the fatherhood of God, then you must also believe in the brotherhood of man, but that today Bob would add the sisterhood of women. So the statement ended in saying how loved Bob is by his family, his friends and his colleagues, and we can just expect a further outpouring of that love up until and continuing on from that public memorial held in Sydney in the coming weeks.
Lily, thanks very much. We're just going to cross now to our Parliament House studio with Mark Kenny, a Senior Fellow at the ANU's Australian Studies Institute and Director at the National Press Club. Mark, thanks for your thoughts tonight. We've been talking about Bob Hawke, the reformer, and the list of achievements. Can you reflect on that?
Well, there's been a fair bit said about this as we've been discussing this tonight. Obviously, things like that great list of environmental projects or assets that he protected, from the Antarctica to the Daintree and a number of others. Marine parks. He did so much for the environment, but of course he did a lot in the economic space with Paul Keating. Particularly, obviously, the Prices and Incomes Accord, that the establishment of superannuation, floating of the dollar, deregulation of the banks, a whole lot of things that absolutely opened up the economy. And I think one of the things we were talking about earlier is the way he and Paul Keating worked together. And I think the thing that sets those politicians apart, and particularly Bob Hawke in the way he led that government, was that he had enormous capital when he came in, enormous political capital, and he was determined to use that political capital to get things done. It's such a contrast with the way we've seen politicians since squandering their political capital and eventually losing all of that through fights internally. But Bob Hawke was determined to work with Paul Keating. He let Keating do a lot of the hard work in terms of that economic reform. But Hawke managed to keep the government together. So he managed some of the politics while Keating managed a lot of the policy. And that was a marker of the way he ran the government. And it was such a successful formula that it did see Labor go through 5 elections. And we don't see that sort of thing anymore.
Mark, just tell us how you think Bob Hawke's death, 2 days out from the election, will affect how the campaign plays out from here.
Yes, well, obviously it's in the atmospherics. It really does sort of put all of the contemporary arguments, most of them pretty stupid arguments, in an election campaign into sort of throws them into the shade. This is sort of much more significant. We can already see one of the material changes that's happened, and that is the newspapers have had to redo their front pages. So on Thursday, that is today, both the leaders have gone about doing their big set-piece speeches, one at the Press Club in the case of Scott Morrison, one at Blacktown Town Hall in the case of Bill Shorten. And they would normally get a lot of coverage for that, and both leaders have also done interviews tonight with Lee Sales on 7:30. So these are their last sort of attempts to really communicate the big ideas, the big sweep of what they're proposing to voters. All that's been knocked off the front pages by what's happened now, by the passing of Bob Hawke. And so we'll see lots of tributes there. There'll be lots of attention on it. And it really does, in a sense, I think it's a really interesting piece of symmetry. He won an election saying bringing Australia together, and he's bringing Australia together on the last day of this election campaign right across the political divide.
Mark Kenny, thanks very much for joining us. We're now going to talk to Stan Grant, who a few months ago delivered the 21st Annual Hawke Lecture. Stan, thanks for talking to us tonight. I'd like to ask you, we've been talking about Bob Hawke's many achievements while in office. As far as Indigenous affairs are concerned, how well did he work in that area, and what achievements did he do?
Well, it was a remarkable period, of course, in Indigenous affairs, the Hawke years, because we had the historic Mabo decision where the whole doctrine of terra nullius, this idea that Australia was founded as an empty land and that Indigenous people had no rights to that land, was overturned in that landmark High Court ruling. And that led ultimately to native title, which of course continues until today. And that native title legislation was negotiated directly with the Hawke government and Indigenous leaders. And that was probably the most significant ruling of the High Court in our time, and it changed the nature of Australia. And he had to negotiate with Indigenous people, but also with concerned parties, pastoralists, miners, placate some of the fear campaign that was spreading throughout Australia and allay a lot of those fears about just what this may mean for the country and what it may mean for the security of title. So that was a landmark piece of legislation and a landmark reform. Of course, he also promised at the Barunga statement in the Northern Territory to deliver a treaty with Indigenous people. That failed to materialise. There was facing the headwinds of resistance from various elements of politics and business and mining and others, but there was still that intention to try to move forward and finish what is known broadly, Andrew, as the unfinished business. But he conceded at the end of his term, and conceded quite tearfully, that it was an area of policy that he wished he'd been able to do more in, that there was an element of failure or an element of not being able to deliver to the extent that he would have liked.
Stan, what do you think his legacy will be?
Well, he's one of those pivotal figures that arrived at a really crucial point, Karina, in not just Australian history, but in global history. Consider the period of the Hawke years. This was the period that saw the Berlin Wall come down. This was the end of the Cold War. This was the beginning of universalism, globalisation, rapid expansion of free trade. He and Paul Keating together implemented the Asia-Pacific Economic Conference, the meeting of Asia-Pacific leaders. He saw the rise of Asia and the rise of China as an opportunity for Australia, and relocated Australia and Australia's strategic outlook very much more towards Asia. It was also the period, of course, of the Tiananmen massacre and that tearful and emotional response from Bob Hawke to that, and his decision to allow thousands of Chinese students to remain in Australia. So it was an extraordinarily pivotal time in global history, and a time of great economic change. And you've been hearing throughout the evening about the reforms that Hawke and Keating were able to implement that set up the 25 plus years of economic growth that Australia has enjoyed, changed our banking industry, deregulated that, floated the dollar. All of these economic reforms that set up the growth that we've enjoyed for the past quarter of a century. So a remarkable figure, not just in Australia, but at an historical juncture in our world.
Stan Grant, thanks for your thoughts.
It's a pleasure, thank you.
Well, let's return to our studio guest. Susan Ryan is the former Aged Care Discrimination Commissioner and a Minister in the Hawke government, and Wendy McCarthy, former National Women's Advisory Council member and close personal friend of Hazel Hawke. Wendy, how important was family to Bob Hawke?
I think in a very traditional way, Bob totally valued the idea of a family. There's no doubt that the relationship with Hazel was a very long love affair until it wasn't, but it was from a very young age. They were together and very deeply in love, and I think the family was the arrival of the children was seen as we all did in those days, the next step. I think, though, that it was... I think he felt really sad, as we saw when he cried that night on television. He did feel that he had not paid enough attention to that family, and that Hazel, he would acknowledge, and certainly when we had the little private funeral for Hazel and lunch, he said, I probably wasn't the best father or husband, but he was for a while. And I think that, when you take a look at someone's life, you have to say, what does the whole long view look like? And it started off as a dream family, and he was negligent, I suppose, at the time that he was the ACTU, and that was, we just have to acknowledge that was part of his life. The remarkable thing from one of my observations was his capacity to give up alcohol when he went to the lodge. And that to me, in my observation there, that was a very happy time for them. And Hazel, they were equals then, and I think Hazel felt very much that was one of the happiest times for the family.
How many sacrifices did she have to make being the wife of Bob Hawke?
Well, I think quite a lot, and I think that she became a part of the early feminist movement in a fairly tentative way, and that's when I first met her, and she was left with the responsibility, as many wives are to raise the children. So he did what he did, but she started to yearn for and long for something more than that. And that's when she started doing a welfare course and working with the Brotherhood of St Lawrence and developing her female network. So she had a very strong network, we did, of mutual friends who were emerging at that time in leadership positions in some cases. And Hazel felt quite wistful about that. But when the marriage did break up, she also had another very happy time with her family and being an independent woman. So if we look at Hazel's life, it's not a life that we have to feel sad about. We can say it's actually quite triumphant.
Susan, I wanted to ask you about something Wendy said there about Bob Hawke acknowledging that he made mistakes in the marriage and that he maybe wasn't there as much as he should have been. What do you think that says about him, that he acknowledged that?
Well, he was always, blindingly honest.
Yes.
I mean, he was never a person who tried to make excuses or cover up, and he could express his regret. He could express his that he'd made these mistakes, and he was pained by them. It wasn't just, oh yes, I wasn't a very good father. He was deeply distressed, but he could express it, and I think that reflected his capacity to express himself and to admit what he'd done that was wrong.
And he also was an adorable grandfather.
And he admitted that obviously on a personal level. Did he admit that as a leader?
I don't think there were any mistakes from Bob's point of view in terms of his cabinet leadership. I cannot recall any. On the other hand, I don't think he made any either.
Susan Ryan and Wendy McCarthy, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you.
Well, one of the nation's most charismatic and popular Prime Ministers, Bob Hawke, as we've been reporting, died today at the age of 89. Mr Hawke led the country from 1983 to 1991.
As well as substantial economic and industrial relations reform, the Hawke era was also marked by environmental activism. There have been tributes today from Prime Ministers past and present remembering him as a representative for the country on the world stage, as well as a man for the everyday Australian.
I prefer to deal directly with the Australian people, and it's been a successful relationship.
Thanks for all your support.
Oh, he's a nice man. I mean, he really is.
G'day. 1983 went much as I'd planned it. I dominated it.
Any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up today is a bum. On your marks. Get set.
How much of that description that I gave there, which is from the National Times, is true? We'll take it. Swears like a trooper?
Oh, yeah?
This one I'm not quite sure about. Performs like a playboy?
I have my moments.
He was a golden character in many ways. You know, he was a one-off, he's an original, but he always had as a genuine belief in the goodness of the Australian people and a genuine determination to make things better for them.
I'll buy you a drink, Gazza.
Hooray for Bob Hawke! Hooray!
The Hawke leadership showed that if you've got a leader seen as being above class, above party, a consensus leader, the Labor Party can be a majority party.
Familiar scenes as excited school children milled around the Prime Minister. Some of them held...
Born Robert James Lee Hawke, but Australia knew him as Bob. Bob Hawke's life started off in a tiny speck on the South Australian map called Bordertown. Born to Congregationalist minister Clem and his schoolteacher wife Ellie.
My mother had a fanatical commitment to education.
Ellie Hawke felt in her every bone that her son was destined for greatness, that he would one day be Prime Minister.
I think that Mum seemed to have had some view about it, you know, when I was born. I don't know. She said there was something special, but that's a bit embarrassing to talk about.
Mother Hawke was to be right on the money. Her bright little spark became a talented pupil. The Rhodes Scholar took economics at Oxford. On his return, he went to the Australian Council of Trade Unions, where he fought for higher wages at the Conciliation and Arbitration Commission.
When you're president of the ACTU, not even a seriously wrecked back can prevent the paperwork piling up or stop the phone calls coming.
Where he was extraordinarily popular.
Well, he sort of turned leading the ACTU into a species of show business. There was an industrial dispute, there was a moment of tension before he, as president of the ACTU, came in. He'd arrive on the scene, he'd bring the two sides together, he'd produce what seemed a well-crafted compromise.
It was at this point that his pledge of temperance to his mother Ellie went thoroughly out the window. Bob Hawke, the ACTU president, was a dedicated drinker.
He probably used alcohol more than any public figure, any leader in our history.
I tend, I think, occasionally to take too much refuge in having a drink.
He was drunk a lot of the time. He obviously used alcohol as a way of breaking down barriers, of gaining quick intimacy, steering people towards some emotion-laden compromise.
Mr. Hawke, in a recent newspaper article, you said that you believed that you had the makings of a Prime Minister.
He gave up the grog and in 1980 became a member for the safe Victorian federal seat of Wills.
Just said to myself, if you're going to become Prime Minister of this country, you can't afford ever to be in a position where you can make a fool of yourself or of your country. And I never had a drop by the whole period I was in Parliament.
The prime ministerial ambitions took 3 years to be realised. Liberal Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser was on the nose, but there were questions about Labor opposition leader Bill Hayden's ability to wrest government from him. The hugely popular Hawke was the obvious alternative. The deal was done in January 1983 in Brisbane.
Even as the party's parliamentary executive arrived for today's meeting here in Brisbane, Mr Hayden's fate had been sealed. He'd been approached after private meetings overnight and reluctantly advised to stand aside.
I believe that a drover's dog could lead the Labor Party to victory, the way the country is and the way the opinion polls are showing up for the Labor Party.
Bill Hayden has done a remarkably courageous thing.
Malcolm Fraser, who was very nervous of the possibility of facing Hawke instead of Hayden, decided to go to Yarralumla and call an election, thinking he better call it quickly while he still got Hayden. However, as he was in the process of doing that, we had already instated Bob.
Australia's most dramatic day in politics since November the 11th, 1975.
So it was I think, the greatest political coincidence in Australian political history, the way that worked. People were so excited, and it was like that from then on. That campaign was remarkable.
Mr. Fraser, did you have any second thoughts this afternoon when you found out that you were likely to face Mr Hawke and not Mr Hayden?
On the contrary, I had a little more relish. It'll be the first election in which two Labor leaders have been knocked off in one go.
That was not to be. Bob Hawke won in a landslide.
Looking down at the crowd which is down below here at the tally room in Canberra, waving.
Labor needs, to pull in the middle-class voters, Labor needs a nimble-footed leader who can straddle the divisions and get fundamentally get middle-class people to record a vote for a trade union, working class-based party. And Hawke was preeminently good at that.
In partnership with his brash treasurer, Hawke set about transforming the Australian economy through the historic wage accord between big business and unions.
Mr Hawke was elected on a promise of bringing Australians together. Well, after just 5 weeks, there they are. The captains of industry, the union bosses, the politicians.
When the phone started ringing in dealing rooms this morning, trading was frenetic.
Floating the Australian dollar and tariff cuts.
The idea of the Workers' Party, the trade union-based party, a Labor or Social Democratic party, opening the economy up to market-based reforms. That was the fusion that was special about Bob Hawke's leadership and his partnership with Keating.
He wanted to be Prime Minister, but he wanted to be Prime Minister for a purpose. And because he went there for a purpose, he was prepared to take risks. Politicians these days are not big risk takers. He was a very big risk taker.
There were also huge social policy shifts, like embracing environmentalism, going to the High Court to save the Franklin Dam.
My government will honour the promises that we have made in respect to Tasmania.
They were very heady years for environmentalism, and Bob Hawke was the captain of the ship.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister of Australia.
In the foreign policy area, he gave a new definition to Australian nationalism. He made us a major player on the global stage. As we globalised, as we took advantage of the opportunities that were there for us to compete internationally, we became a different country.
He was the master of the media opportunity, embracing television like no other before him.
I can get nicked. Yeah, really. And if I want to appear coatless talking to a yarn event, I will.
The next guest I've got is no stranger to us all. It's our Prime Minister, Mr. Bob Hawke. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you.
Bob had the habits of an ordinary Australian bloke. He liked the races. He had liked to drink.
He makes us all look well dressed.
Hawke-era Defence Minister Kim Beazley says the PM was always across his cabinet submissions, but brought a common touch to his understanding of them.
Bob would say, you know, it's really good, it's very interesting, I've read through this submission. But, you know, I was at the races the other day and Bill Smith came up to me and he said this about your issue. Now, Bill's got a point.
He did at times have a famously fiery temper.
I made that statement that I will not be making a challenge, and I adhere to that statement. And now, if you want to do your speculation, do it without me. I've made my position clear. But you could kill it stone dead here and now by saying, no, come on, now grab hold of yourself. I've made it quite clear. I've said it 3 times. Now, you are just being a bloody pest.
Mr. Hawke, could I ask you whether you feel a little embarrassed tonight at the blood that's on your hands?
You're not improving, are you? I thought you'd make a better start to the year than that. It's a ridiculous question. You know it's ridiculous. I have no blood on my hands. You look a bit tired. You don't cease to be a husband. You don't cease to be a father.
He wore his heart on his sleeve, most memorably when he discovered his daughter Rosalind and her partner had a heroin problem.
Like any father, I love my daughter. I trust her.
That, I think, was what was so difficult for Bob, to just not be able to, if you like, absorb that shock properly or do the grieving about that shock. It was sitting there like a lump.
With him through it all was his loyal wife and mother to their children, Hazel Hawke. She had weathered being married to a man who was often a workaholic with a wandering eye. But Susan Ryan says that his reputation as a ladies' man should not be confused with sexism. Ryan was Australia's first female minister appointed by Hawke, who at the ACTU had championed equal pay for women.
It was then a great relief as a young woman, a feminist with very clear feminist objectives in all the work I did, to work with a man who was relaxed about women. See, with Bob, he never worried about women because he knew he was better than anyone else, and that included all women.
In a confidential agreement, Hawke had pledged to step aside from the top job by 1990 in favour of his ambitious treasurer. When that deadline passed, with Hawke showing no sign of bowing out, Keating launched a challenge and eventually toppled the Prime Minister in 1991. The dumping of Hawke led to a bitter rift between Hawke and Keating, which lasted years.
The circumstances were upsetting. But looking back on it, one of the enormous pluses of the end of my prime ministership was that it led to the situation where I married Blanche.
After he left the top office, Bob Hawke ended his rocky marriage with Hazel Hawke, who sadly later died after a battle with Alzheimer's disease. He resumed his relationship with his biographer and former lover, Blanche Del Puget. They married in 1995.
And that has been, just an indescribable joy in my life.
The boy from Border Town became a successful businessman with a harbourside mansion to show for it. He didn't lose his sense of humour and from time to time enjoyed the odd cold beer.
Listen, they're going skull, skull, skull. And the great man Bobby Hawke nailed it.
Still Labor to his bootstraps in his 80s, he wowed the comrades at the ACTU National Conference in 2012.
So here we go.
He campaigned for his ALP successors.
Help Bill Shorten and Labor stand up to protect Medicare.
This Medicare scare campaign raised the ire of the coalition, but in it, Bob Hawke helped almost tilt Malcolm Turnbull out of office.
Right till the end, he's packed a political punch.
Bob Hawke, ladies and gentlemen.
In whatever way you can, try and help those around you. This is both the right and the good thing to do, but also it'll make your own life more satisfying.
I always smile when I think of him because he was always, twinkling and laughing. I think he was like a great burst of sunshine on the Australian political scene, and easy to like, easy to get on with, but with such a brain and such determination that he changed Australia for the better, and we should all really thank our lucky stars that he's been part of our lives.
And Corinna, the news of Bob Hawke's death broke early this evening, which meant, of course, newspapers had to put aside their election coverage for the established coverage of the death of the 23rd Prime Minister.
We'll bring you the SMH front page now, which we showed you a little earlier, that portrait of Bob Hawke and the headline, The Fearless Reformer. We can go on now to the Daily Telegraph's front page. It's a double spread larrikin leader, which we've been hearing about this evening in a lot of the coverage.
And that's where we leave our viewers on ABC television.
And stay with us now on the ABC News Channel.
Bob Hawke, Australia's 23rd Prime Minister and Labor Party legend, has died at the age of 89. Mr Hawke led the country and his party from 1983 to 1991. And his contribution to public life helped shape modern Australia.
Former Labor Minister Craig Emerson spoke on behalf of Mr Hawke's family, saying a memorial service will be held in Sydney in the coming weeks.
I'd like to make a statement, effectively to read Blanche Del Puget's statement on the passing of her beloved husband, Bob Hawke. Blanche says, "Today we lost Bob Hawke, a great Australian. Many would say the greatest Australian of the post-war era. He died peacefully at home at the age of 89 years. I and Bob's children, Sue, Steve and Roslyn, and stepson Louis, and his grandchildren will hold a private funeral. A memorial service will be held in Sydney in coming weeks. Bob Hawke and Paul Keating and their governments modernised the Australian economy, paving the way for an unprecedented period of recession-free economic growth and job creation. Bob's consensus-style approach of bringing together the trade union movement and the business community boosted job opportunities while increasing the social wage through Medicare and extra financial support for low-income families. Together with his highly talented cabinets, Bob foresaw the Asian century and positioned Australia to take full advantage of it through a program of sweeping economic reforms. Among Bob's proudest achievements were large increases in the proportion of children finishing high school, his role in ending apartheid in South Africa, and especially his successful international campaign to protect Antarctica from mining. Bob abhorred racism and bigotry. His father, the Reverend Clem Hawke, told Bob that if you believed in the fatherhood of God, then you must also believe in the brotherhood of man. Bob would add today the sisterhood of women. Bob was dearly loved by his family and so many friends and colleagues. We will miss him. The golden bowl is broken.
Craig Emerson there, and the federal Labor leader Bill Shorten says Australia has lost a favourite son. Let's take a look.
I would like to thank Craig Emerson and Blanche de Pilge for asking me to say a few words on behalf of the Labor Party and the Labor movement. Tonight, the nation and Labor are in mourning. We have lost a favourite son. Bob Hawke loved Australia, and Australia loved Bob Hawke. But his legacy will endure forever. Bob Hawke changed Australia for the better. He brought people together. He brought Australia together. He modernised our economy. He transformed our society. He protected our environment. I last had the privilege of seeing Bob last week on his back veranda, sitting out there with his beloved Blanche, supported by Craig. He had his son, the sun on his face, had a crossword in front of him, a cup of tea. He didn't speak about himself to me. He did as he always does. Asked about the ALP and the election. We all loved Bob Hawke. We'll miss him a great deal. May he rest in peace. The condolences of my party and my movement to the great Bob Hawke.
Bill Shorten speaking earlier this evening. Well, let's hear now from the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison.
Tonight, Australians have all learned the news of the passing of one of Australia's great Prime Ministers, and certainly Labor's greatest Prime Minister, in my view. The 23rd Prime Minister of Australia, Robert James Lee Hawke. His achievements will be spoken of in the days ahead, but the thing Australians will remember most about him was the bloke. He made Australia stronger through his contribution to public life. He had a great intellect, he had enormous passion, and he had courage. And that was able to sustain him in being the longest-serving Labor Prime Minister of all time. But it was his ability to connect with everyday Australians, with a word, with that larrikin wit, with that connection and an understanding of everyday Australian life that we will most remember Bob Hawke. I want to extend to Bob's wife Blanche, on behalf of Jenny and I, our deep personal sympathies, and to all of Bob's family, and also to acknowledge the late Hazel Hawke as well. Bob lived a full life. He lived a rich life, and in his life he blessed many others. And for that, I think, as Australians, we can give him great thanks. One thing I remember amongst many, it was Bob Hawke who changed our national anthem to say, "Australians all, let us rejoice." And tonight, while I'm sure I extend to the Labor movement and to Bill Shorten and his party my deep sympathies on behalf of our political movement. I think we can all say, as Australians, that we rejoice in the life of Bob Hawke. We thank him for his service to our nation, and we pray now that he rest in peace. Thank you, Bob.
Scott Morrison speaking earlier from Brisbane Airport. Well, under the stewardship of Prime Minister Bob Hawke and his Treasurer Paul Keating, Australia's economy underwent a seismic transformation.
The decisions to float the dollar and deregulate the financial system were at the heart of the overhaul.
He presided over what's widely considered the greatest period of economic reform in Australian history. The irony is it took an ex-union boss to lead the change. As Prime Minister, Bob Hawke used the formidable negotiating and deal-making skills he honed at the Australian Council of Trade Unions to launch an economic transformation.
I want to assure you,
he convened an economic summit weeks after taking office, involving companies, unions, church leaders and all levels of government.
then these past 4 days will indeed prove to be a turning point in the conduct and in the character of the affairs and the concerns of this great nation of ours.
A damaging spiral of price rises and wage rises dogged the nation in the 1970s and early 80s.
All in favour of the motion, please raise your right hand.
Hawke brokered a prices and incomes accord, the first of many, under which unions agreed to reduce wages and strikes in return for social benefits, such as spending on health and education.
When the phone started ringing in dealing rooms this morning, trading was frenetic.
In its first year, the Hawke government took the radical step of floating the Australian dollar, against the advice of Treasury boss John Stone.
He said to me as he came past, he said, "Prime Minister, you'll live to regret this decision."
History is with Hawke. Letting the market shift the currency up and down has helped the economy withstand economic shocks. His government deregulated the financial system and introduced competition from foreign banks. The Commonwealth Bank and airlines were privatised at a time when public ownership was still a Labor movement article of faith.
I can't see any social democratic principle that's involved in government running an airline.
His government gave the Reserve Bank power to set the official interest rate free from government interference, a reform still in place today. It wasn't all plain sailing. Banks collapsed during the excesses of the 80s, and by the early 90s...
The first thing to say is that the accounts do show that Australia is in a recession. The most important thing about that is that this is a recession that Australia had to have.
Australia faced the worst downturn since the Great Depression. But there hasn't been another since, partly because of changes Bob Hawke and his Treasurer Paul Keating put in place. Keating is often given much of the credit for the economic reforms, but could he have achieved his vision without Hawke's ability to bring the Labor movement along?
It was the most disappointing moment of Bob Hawke's political career when he was dumped in 1991 as Prime Minister in a Labor party room coup, the culmination of long-standing tensions with his Treasurer Paul Keating.
Here's what the defeated Prime Minister had to say moments after the results of the vote were publicly announced.
If this was 11 years ago, I'd be getting pretty thoroughly drunk. But fortunately, fortunately for me, and even more fortunately for others, that is 11 years ago, and the only beer that will be passing my lips will be the totally non-alcoholic variety.
Well, one of the last images we have of Bob Hawke is this photograph taken with Paul Keating. Just days ago, they issued their first joint statement in 28 years to claim Labor's ownership of the economy and endorsed Bill Shorten to run it. In 1991, Paul Keating resigned as Bob Hawke's Treasurer to challenge him for the Prime Ministership.
Former Greens leader Bob Brown says Bob Hawke had the best environmental record of any Australian PM.
he began, as the package just told us, with the saving of the Franklin River. He actually went to the election in 1983 saying that he would stop the dam if elected, and that was the one commitment he made on the night of that election, on 5th of March, that the dam would stop and he would give compensation to Tasmania. And after a battle through the High Court, he did just that.
Yeah, Bob, just talk us through those events, because, of course, before he came to power in late 1982, there was a blockade on the river and the proposed dam. Bob Hawke came to power in March 1983, but the Tasmanian government ignored federal regulations and legislation. So how did he overcome that problem?
Well, he took the Democrats' World Heritage Protection legislation that was then in the Senate and modified it, but put it through both houses of Parliament. And that gave him the power through the Constitution's external treaties power, which enabled the Commonwealth Government to uphold an external treaty, the World Heritage Convention, overriding the court decided by 4 judges to 3, overriding the Tasmanian state's ability to manage its own lands and therefore its own rivers. So the dam, which had been well underway, they'd spent $70 million on it. The whispering bulldozer Liberal Premier of Tasmania, Robin Gray, when it was stopped. But it was the leadership of Hawke in carrying that through. And he risked seats in Tasmania. In fact, he lost every seat in Tasmania in that election in 1983, but he gained many more across the mainland because the whole country was galvanised by the beauty of the Franklin River and all those people being arrested in the rainforest. And he carried through with it. And then he went on, of course, to have a brace of other great places in Tasmania, from Uluru to the Daintree to Shark Bay and more, inscribed in the World Heritage List, and therefore protected as not just national monuments, but as part of the World Heritage suite of properties. He added more of Kakadu and the Gondwanan Forest of northern New South Wales, for example, and then took a role with Paul Keating in the leading the protection of Antarctica through the Madrid Protocol in 1997. It was signed after Bob had lost office, but he took a formidable role when America was holding out in getting that protocol up, which has protected Antarctica from mining until at least 2047.
And Bob, did you see this as his own personal convictions as opposed to doing what might have been popular?
I think there was both those things, because I think Hawke was a Prime Minister who had a very keen ear to what was going on in wider Australian society. And there was this big wish after the destruction of Lake Pedder a decade earlier by Australians to have their great places protected as national parks and World Heritage areas rather than simply going under the bulldozer. And for example, after the Franklin, he took on Joe Jelke-Peterson over the Daintree rainforest in northern Queensland, and again using that World Heritage power, he protected those rainforests which were about to be ripped to bits by land exploitation, real estate exploitation and so on. So, and Graham Richardson, of course, he brought in as his Minister for the Environment, and Richardson faced a howling mob up there, but Hawke empowered Richardson in a way we've never seen before or since to protect Australia's environment, and I think that'll be an enormous legacy for which Australians will be thanking him as Prime Minister for centuries to come.
Former Greens leader Bob Brown speaking to us earlier. Let's hear from Insider's host and former press secretary to Bob Hawke, Barry Cassidy now. He says Bob Hawke's policies had a profound impact on the Australian economy.
I think he deserves to be remembered as certainly the Labor Party's greatest leader. He won 4 elections. No other Labor leader did that. And he was a great reformer. Together with Paul Keating, he did open up the Australian economy to the world, including floating the dollar. The very first thing he did as Prime Minister was to get together the Economic Summit.
that brought together the unions and the employers, and everybody sat around, and out of that emerged the Prices and Incomes Accord, and that had a profound influence on the Australian economy for years to come.
It was all about consensus, wasn't it, Barry?
Well, he said that. His slogan in 1983 when he first came to office was bringing Australia together. Now, as he saw it, there had been a fairly disruptive period before that under Malcolm Fraser, but his view was that Australia needed to be brought together, and to do that, you needed consensus. You needed somebody who could talk to both the unions and the employers, and he could do that. He had a lot of friends among the employers, some of the biggest employers in Australia, and he really made that work for him.
How would you describe his leadership style, and what was it like to work with him?
Well, he was a consensus leader, and he liked to talk his way through issues. A lot of people thought he was kind of an abrasive character because he didn't suffer fools. He didn't particularly like the media, and so occasionally he was pretty scratchy in some of those situations. But he wasn't like that at all when he was trying to negotiate his way through a difficult problem. He would sit down, he was a very good listener, and he would spend ages just listening, which again would surprise a lot of people. And then at the end of an hour or so, he might make some sort of a judgment on what he had just heard. And he was easy to work with. He was very patient with some people who were learning on the job, including myself. He was a delight to work with.
Yeah, he was described as a larrikin. He liked to drink, but of course, famously, he gave that up.
Look, he wouldn't have succeeded as Prime Minister if he hadn't done that. I think that's a reasonable assessment to make. He had a problem. He had a serious problem with drinking. But he exercised that. That was enormous discipline to give it up after those years, and to give it up for the entire time that he was Prime Minister. The drinking was kind of... it wasn't just that he held the world record, for speed drinking at Oxford University. It was more than that. He was a constant drinker, and it was having an impact on his family and on his professional life. But, he knuckled down and gave it away, and it just worked for him.
What was it about him that attracted you to want to work with him?
Well, because I was from Melbourne, and I had maybe a stronger sense of the guy than some of the people by the time I'd got to the Canberra Press Gallery. And I just had a feeling he was going to be somebody really special. And because I sensed very early on that ability he had to communicate with people, and that people felt comfortable with him. He had ideas. He would go into elections, full of ideas. And so I thought at the time that if I was ever going to get an experience from, politics from the inside, it's probably only Bob Hawke that I could do it with, certainly of the field that was available at the time. And I never regretted it. It was just a wonderful learning experience.
Barry, earlier you told us about what impressed you most about Bob Hawke. Can you tell us again?
He abhorred racism and bigotry, and whenever he experienced it, he called it out. You didn't have to go to Bob Hawke and say, look, this has just happened. What should we do? He would hear it and he would respond. He would react instantly. And he had a history of that. As I explained before, he had a history in his fight against apartheid. And he played a major role in terms of turning over apartheid in South Africa. But before that, he led the protests against the Springboks when they came to Australia, when he was ACTU leader. When there was talk of a discriminatory immigration policy, he was right onto it. He didn't care whether that might be popular with the public or not. He went to town on it straight away, went into the Parliament with a resolution, and ended up embarrassing the opposition at the time. So, look, he was just so instinctive on that issue, absolutely instinctive, and that's probably the most profound impact I think that he had on me in the whole time that I was with him.
Barry Cassidy, Insider's host, and Bob Hawke's former press secretary. Well, often referred to as the larrikin leader, Bob Hawke rose from union roots to be the most popular Labor Prime Minister in history.
He loved a beer, a laugh, sport, and lived life to the fullest. But the same traits that endeared him to the public also threatened to derail his career.
Bob Hawke could work a room or pub like no other, able to mix effortlessly with everyone from labourers to matriarchs and even swimwear models.
I think Bob Hawke, in my personal opinion, will end up Prime Minister.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I think he's number one.
Well, I think Bob Hawke is the man that they really need.
I worked as a builder's labourer. I worked as labourer on the chain gang and the abattoirs. And that's where I've, in a sense, felt happy.
Hawkey, as he was nicknamed, was also fond of a beer, and at university held the world record for sculling a yard glass. Later in life, he was still happy to raise and down a glass to the delight of the masses. But his love affair with the amber fluid came to a self-imposed end when he became Prime Minister in 1983. The larrikin PM, though, shone through. He loved cracking a joke and sport, was a keen golfer and cricketer. He also rejoiced in one of Australia's greatest sporting victories, the America's Cup.
I tell you what, any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up today is a bum.
Not long after, during the annual Pollies versus Journos cricket match, a rising delivery deflected into his face, smashing his glasses. It was feared he could lose the sight in the eye, but he wasn't fazed.
How was it, Mr.
Oh, well, I have felt better, but it's okay.
Prime Minister Hawke didn't shy from unusual media opportunities, from being a guest of Molly on Countdown to playing himself in the hugely popular TV soap A Country Practice.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me to your party. I wasn't sure whether I was going to be able to make it or not.
He was also an openly emotional man, weeping at a news conference when his daughter's drug addiction was raised.
You don't cease to be a husband. You don't cease to be a father.
Bob Hawke's knockabout character certainly endeared him to the public, with his approval ratings frequently soaring to over 70%, making him arguably Australia's most loved PM.
ABC political editor Andrew Probyn remembers a poignant moment of his prime ministership.
I speak to you from the Parliament House. Bob Hawke was the first Prime Minister to be Prime Minister in this new building, opened in 1989, and there's a lot of places around this building where you have cause for reflecting on Bob Hawke. In the press gallery, there's a hilarious picture of him opening Radio Alley, and he's duelling with Andrew Peacock in the most hilarious of manners. And we also have another picture in the press gallery. I'd like to show it actually to you because I've just asked someone to take it off the wall. Now, I happen to be the captain of the parliamentary press gallery team, and we got a very famous picture of Bob Hawke framed, and we actually asked him to sign it a couple of years ago. And I'm going to show it to you here because it tells you a lot about the man, as love of life. There's quite a wire there. Now, you see, it's that famous picture of him getting belted in the face during a game. It was bowled by Gary O'Neill, who was then a Herald reporter. It was the day before, believe it or not, the day before the 1984 election started. Now, Gary O'Neill felt terrible about this. He just felled the Prime Minister, who was on 28 runs. And I was reliably told that he might have been out earlier in the day, but he turned to the umpire and said, "I don't think that was out, was it?" So he kept batting and then got belted in the face by Gary O'Neill. Shards of glass ended up being in his eye.
There was serious concern about his eyesight.
We did play some of that vision earlier, so I wonder if we can dig it up again.
Yes, we could dig it up, but so there was a young reporter who took a shard of glass from his eye. He was whisked off to Canberra Hospital, but he was back about an hour later, lounging in his budgie smugglers on a banana chair. Now, the next day, the election started, and Bob Hawke decided that he would ask a one-eyed Bob Hawke, I might add at this stage, that it was first day of the election campaign. He asked Gary O'Neill to be somewhat of a victim. They strung a line between two ships in Jervis Bay, and Bob Hawke said that Gary O'Neill should be the one who was strung up between those two ships.
That is Andrew Probyn with his recollections from the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Reporter Lily Mayers has been outside the Hawke family home in Sydney with details of a public memorial planned for Bob Hawke.
A statement has been released by Bob Hawke's wife, Blanche Dalpouget, this evening. It said the former Prime Minister died peacefully here in his Northbridge home in Sydney's north. The 89-year-old is survived by his wife, Blanche, as well as their 3 children and Bob Hawke's stepchildren. The statement said there will be a private funeral held for Bob Hawke's family. That will then be followed by a public memorial held in Sydney in the coming weeks. The statement then listed some of Bob Hawke's proudest achievements. They included, of course, establishing Medicare, increasing the proportion of children finishing high school in the country, positioning Australia into the Asia century, having a role in ending apartheid in South Africa and protecting Antarctica from mining. The statement pointed out how Bob Hawke and Paul Keating's partnership led Australia into a more modern economy and led to an unprecedented period of recession-free growth in the country. The statement made special mention of the role of Bob Hawke's father, Reverend Clem Hawke. The statement said Reverend Clem Hawke told Bob that if you believed in the brotherhood of God, then you must then believe in the brotherhood of man. But that today Bob would add the sisterhood of women. The statement ended by saying how loved Bob Hawke is by his family, his friends and his colleagues, and we can expect that love to continue outpouring until that public memorial is held in Sydney in the next couple of weeks.
Lily Mayers reporting from outside Bob Hawke's home in Sydney. Well, Bob Hawke was the atypical Prime Minister, a larrikin, but also a man who showed his emotions. He was at home in a pub as he was in a concert hall.
And in 2009, at the age of 79, he even took on the conductor duties at the Sydney Opera House. Let's have a look. What a fabulous moment. Goes to show he was a showman.
Oh, really, truly was. Don't you think that was a really apt piece of footage to come to a close of our coverage on?
Absolutely, because so many people have been remembering fond memories of Bob Hawke, including Labor figures, as you'd expect, including Anthony Albanese. Tonight he said, a Labor legend has passed tonight. Bob Hawke showed us how to govern and transformed modern Labor. Respect.
Labor's Tony Burke tweeted that the Bob Hawke I admired was the man who saved the Franklin, the Daintree, Kakadu and protected Antarctica from mining. And the Bob Hawke I befriended and laughed with every New Year's Eve was a fellow music fan with Blanche every summer at the Woodford Folk Festival. What a life.
And the current Secretary of the ACTU, a role that Bob Hawke formerly held himself, said in a statement, this is Sally McManus, the entire union movement grieves for the passing of Bob Hawke. Medicare, superannuation, modern Australia union movement hero.
And there really have been so many tributes that people have paid on social media. We haven't been able to get to all of them, but Paul Keating has issued a statement and he said with Bob Hawke's passing today, the great partnership I enjoyed with him passes too, a partnership we forged with the Australian people. Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister, she paid tribute, touching tribute to Bob Hawke, and she went on to say, when I last saw Bob, he was facing his own mortality with a sense of calm. He was ready and taking great comfort looking back on a life so well lived.
And of course, Karina, this comes around 36 hours before we go to the polls. So the newspapers have had to put their election coverage to one side, and here we have the Sydney Morning Herald, the fearless reformer.
We can move on to the Daily Telegraph, which has a double-page spread on Larrikin leader legend.
And from the Northern Territory News, Bob Hawke.
With a pint of beer in fitting NT News tribute. Well, that's the latest from us. Stay with us. Beverly O'Connor is continuing our coverage of the death of former Prime Minister Bob Hawke. Thanks for your company tonight.